Monday, everybody. Today we will speak about altruism and empathy. As usual, I will read my notes because without them I cannot explain my thoughts. Okay, so let's start. Altruism is another of the components of ethics, along with empathy and the already mentioned perception. The altruistic behavior, in this sense of doing good to others even to the detriment of its own well-being, has a function or an effect on biological competition that is present also in many animal species that has a neural structure sufficiently developed. It comes from an innate genetic condition that are specific for humans, and there are also other conditioning learned in the social life. Empathy, that is the capacity of fully understand the feelings and mood of others, and altruism are neural structure with a strong interrelation cause effect between them, considering the fact that the perceive the others is based on empathy, while acting for the others is an evolutionary form of protection for the social group or population to which one refers itself. It is perhaps not correct thinking that the forms of altruism are granted only on the basis to have something in return, something material in return. One example is a relationship between mother and a child totally off balance in favor of the child. The mother instinctively nourishes and takes care of the child and does not need a reward, either social or material, to carry out these functions, even though if these rewards can give a reinforcement of the behavior. Moreover, if we consider that breastfeeding is debilitating due to consumption of mother's body reserves, we can understand that most likely neuronal circuits have structures that give a sense of fulfillment of satisfaction for a wide series of actions that respond to the previous to the provision of altruistic behavior. In addition to the instinctual component, part of the altruistic and empathic behavior is mediated by learning, depending on the social environment in which one lives, as explained by Dessity through this text. Empathic concern is often associated with prosocial behaviors such as helping kin and as being considered as a chief enabling process for altruism. Wilson suggested that empathic helping behavior has evolved because of its contribution to genetic fitness, kin selection, in other words. In humans and other mammals, an impulse to care for offspring is almost certainly genetically hardwired. It is far less clear that an impulse to care for siblings, more remote kin, and similar non-kin is genetically hardwired. The emergence of altruism, of empathizing with and caring for those who are not kin, is thus not easily explained within the framework of neo-Darwinism theories of natural selection. Social learning explanation of kinship patterns in human helping behavior are thus highly plausible. However, one of the most striking aspects of human empathy is that it can be felt for virtually any target. even target of different species. Here they are meaning about animals. They are speaking about animals. I put something more because, for extension, we can say that a sense of empathy can be felt even for plants and work for art. For example, in Syria conflict, we have seen a lot of destruction of art masterpiece and pieces, and a lot of people have also cried for it. Related to the topic of empathy, must also be mentioned mirror neurons that are a fundamental component of human interaction and socialization. Kandel recalls this discovery. Giacomo Rizzolatti, an Italian neuroscientist, has discovered that when a monkey carries out a specific action with its hands, such as putting a peanut in its mouth, certain neurons in the premotor cortex become active. Remarkably, the same neurons become active when a monkey watches another monkey or even a person put food in its mouth. Rizzolatti calls these mirror neurons and suggests that they provide the first insight into imitation, identification, empathy, and possibly the ability to mime vocalization, the mental processes intrinsic, intrinsic to human interactions. Vilayanur Ramachandran has found evidence of comparable neurons in the premotor cortex of people. These suggest that humans and higher animals are genetically endowed with structures that are used to live in a group to understand the situation in function of social and personal welfare. This is a very important passage. A so word states that empathy refers to the ability to appreciate others' point of view and share their experiences. Simulation theory is based on the assumption that perceiving the actions and emotional expressions of others uses the same neural and cognitive resources that are also used for producing actions and emotional expression of oneself. According to such a view, empathy is an emergent property of a sophisticated set of cognitive processes dedicated to action and emotion, perception and production, rather than reflecting the operation of a dedicated mechanism specialized for empathy. Empathy is therefore a set of processes that are used to understand the emotion and the sensations of others. For example, the insula region is activated both when we are disgusted and when we look at someone else scrunching up their face in an expression of disgust. This suggests that we may, in some literal sense, share the emotion of the people around us. And so I put this sentence. Becomes clear that, for extension, we also share suffering, pain, anger, etc. The brain regions involved in these mechanisms are the anterior cingulated cortex and the insula, in a sort of overlap among of regions activated by the expectation of the pain of another person and the personal pain experience. In this perspective, analysis that serves as an introduction. In this perspective analysis, this analysis serves as an introduction. It would be also interesting to identify precisely where ethics is structured and positioned in the brain. But the difficulty in pointing out an an ambiguous brain representation of the ethics can be understood with the articulated cerebral location of empathy. Empathy is just one of ethic components, so it's easily to understand how hard it is to define all these cerebral areas to define ethics. If it is already so hard to define only empathy, we can understand how hard is to define the cerebral areas of the ethics. With this perspective, we can reflect on this specification related to the empathic behavior. In neuroscience, evidence for this perception-action coupling ranges from electrophysiological recording in monkeys, in which mirror neurons in the ventral premotor and posterior parietal cortices fire during both goal-directed actions and observation of the same actions performed by another individual. To functional neuroimaging experiments in humans that demonstrate that the neural circuits involved in action execution overlaps with the activated when actions are observed. This neural network includes the premotor cortex, the parietal lobe, the supplementary motor area, and the cerebellum. In addition, a number of neuroimaging studies have shown that similar brain areas are reliably activated while imagining one's own action, imagining another's action, and imitating action performed by a model. The perception action mechanism accounts, at least partially, for emotion sharing, which continues the core mechanism for empathy. This model posits that perception of emotion activates in the observer the neural mechanisms that are responsible for the generation of similar emotion. Such a system prompts the observer to resonate with the emotional state of another individual, with the observer activating the motor representation and associate autonomic and somatic responses that stem from the observer target, that is a sort of inverse mapping. Reporting this part of a text of DST, I try to define the areas of the brain related to ethics. So it is not an exhaustive way to represent ethic in the brain, but at least we have an hint to where look for the basic areas of ethics in our brain. If we agreed, so there are many theories that say that animals, especially monkeys, have neither sense of ethics or morality developed as that of humans. The brain areas, so if we agree with this, the brain areas more involved in this reworking of the external inputs and then of the ethical behavior should reside primarily in the outer and evolved parts that are not in other animals. This is the first option. So if everybody say, a lot of researchers say that there is not the same level of ethics in monkeys, so the areas of the brain that born the ethics should be in the more developed part of the external part. The other option is that there are more internal areas in human brain that should have a dimension markedly different related to other species of animals. So the areas of the brain are the same of the monkeys, but this area should have neural circuits that are more developed. If we agree with this idea that monkeys don't have ethics. We have to leave the answer, however, at these doubts to more detailed studies and researches on these topics of the future for the future. In everyday life, when we speak about ethics and the need for the society to implement it in a proper degree, very often we refer in whatever concern the suffering and exploitation of others, who can be elderly people, children, animals, depending on the empathic sense of the different observers. Suffering and exploitation, however, are perceived in different ways by various subjects. Perception occurs primarily through images that, along with sounds, trigger reactions from the receiver. Sometimes also smell affect the sensitivity, especially if they form patterns that can be recalled by the mind. Indeed, the ethical involvement can have at least two models to refer. The first one is the recall of the sensation already experienced, in this specific case, an unpleasant experience about sufferance and exploitation. The second option as a mirror of an action that we would not be directed to us, where we find ourselves involved since we are reflected in the subject who experiences a certain act. For example, the slaughtering is so bloody, violent and loud because of the elements of the animals that for many people are acceptable. This sound, these rumors, and so on. Also, in the most extreme case, even if their own survival depend on it, someone can refuse to kill an animal. It is clear that there can be a sense of empathy toward animals, because most don't like to hear certain sounds or smell certain odors, nor see certain images with specific colors, but also because it can happen the self-identification with a suffering animal. It will be interesting to study how ethics of killing for food changes with the different levels of anger, and at the same time test how the representation of the animal that has to be killed alters at the brain levels in these circumstances with the sounds and the moans that a specific animal species can emit. For example, fish emit less sound of a cow, for example, and fish as don't emit sounds. So about all this, we accept more the killing of the fish respect the killing of the cow. The empathic response thus has a component that can derive from a mirror reaction, such as happen when we see someone who dies on the spot of job or during a working. I use the term mirror not accidentally, but refer to the mirror neurons that we have been discussed earlier. But it is also true that the owner of animals, especially if they are for company, tends to be more sensitive and more easily identified himself with the animal that suffers compared to those who don't. As regards about a sensation already proven, you may find closest to someone who does the same heavy or demeaning job, or if you have already experienced a condition of exploitation. Anyway, we have to consider the difference of perception motivated by the fact that not everybody had the same structure and the same neuronal plasticity, as well as it is influenced by disturbing external and inner condition. For example, television, media, drugs, alcohol, money, periods of depression, personal problems, and heavy condition like for example health conditions that do not allow space for others. We have not to forget then the possibility to find people who take pleasure in seeing others suffer, albeit in different percentage, smaller, compared to those who take pleasure in seeing others happy in the society. Sometimes, but not always, this pleasure comes from the fact that they are themselves subjected to violence and exploitation from which they believe they cannot get out. So we have different levels of perception. So there are different levels of acceptance of violence done and suffering. Different levels of the sufferance experienced by themselves and procured to others, that is strongly mediated by the perception of oneself, of the others, and of the reality. The consequence is different ethics and in the various actors of the society. Having said that, there is another thing to evaluate that is not directly linked to the perception. Even if the person judges behaviors, some behaviors as unethical or not moral, it does not mean that he or she does not fulfill them. The reason can be force majeure that press someone to overrun the limit of personal ethics for reason of survival, need to work, external threat, temporary psychological problems, and so on. Second reason, rules that fall within the sphere of social ethics, so we are in the field of morality, and are less easy to follow this type of rules. These social rules are imposed and perhaps hardly shared, even if considered fair. Sometimes we would apply them valid only for others and not for ourselves. In other cases, these are related to behaviors which, although made in the private sphere, became immoral only when discovered. Third, individuals that lack the will and only after they are overwhelmed by feelings of guilty for the action made. 4. Disease and condition related to the psychic sphere, use of drugs and alcohol, and so on. At the same time, choices that the ethics would impose are not always followed for different causes, such as economic poverty. For example, I buy oranges that are harvested by slaves of other countries because my income does not allow me to make different choices. I regret to buy it, but I have to do it. Or in other cases, in order to have a job, to maintain myself, I have to do things that run against my ethics. And then we can have intellectual poverty. I don't have the cultural elements to make choices that can ensure my psychological balance. As a result, there will be a periodic regret for action done. Okay, for today it's all. Monday, everybody. See you soon.